Okay, folks, so pictured here on the screen is a brain cell, a neuron, as well as a target cell. And so signaling that is occurring in the brain kind of has two components, an electrical component and a chemical component. And we will talk a little bit about both of these today, but you will see that we focus a little bit more on what's happening down at this end. So let's walk ourselves through this slide real quick. So a signal from a brain cell kind of starts here in the main body of the nerve cell. And that signal is kind of passed along the length of this neuron. So the signal, oftentimes called an action potential, which you can see written out here, kind of makes its way along the body of the neuron. Once that signal reaches the end of the neuron, the signal at the end of the neuron is kind of converted into the release of these neurotransmitter molecules that then go on to talk to the target cell to kind of pass the word along, and the signal can continue on its way. The signal that starts here at the beginning of the neuron is an electrical signal. This electrical signal that gets converted to neurotransmitters, those neurotransmitters, that is the chemical signal. In ADHD, it is the chemical signals that are thought to be a bit weak or kind of less than they should be. Folks with ADHD have low dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter or a chemical that is involved in our sense of reward, as well as motor control. Folks with ADHD also have low norepinephrine, and norepinephrine controls alertness, memory, and focus, as well as our fight or flight response. Both of these are important neurotransmitters, and actually they are related to one another, which is interesting as well. So don't worry too much about what's on the right-hand side of the slide, folks. But what I want to be showing you is these neurotransmitters, dopamine and norepinephrine, are just kind of related to each other in this pathway here that I'm showing you. I'm also showing you other neurotransmitters such as serotonin. And so if we have kind of low dopamine and low norepinephrine, you might think that these chemical signals being released at the end of a neuron here would then go on to impact further signaling. And this is true. Abnormal or weak chemical signaling will affect the further signaling that will happen in the brain, such as the electrical signaling that's kind of carried on from neuron to neuron. And this signaling is corrected somewhat by amphetamines. So the class of drug amphetamines are mostly used to treat ADHD. Not all amphetamines, however, are used as medication. So you might be familiar with Adderall and Ritalin. These are kind of the most maybe popular or most well-known amphetamines that are used in the treatment of ADHD. However, you may have also heard of MDMA or speed and meth, and so these are amphetamines as well. However, they are mostly used recreationally and not medicinally. Let's talk a little bit about how or why amphetamines work to begin with. And so let's take a look at the chemicals themselves to try to understand this. So here at the top, folks, we have a 2D structure of amphetamine. And below this structure, I have a series of neurotransmitters. In particular, we discussed dopamine, as well as, if I go back to this slide real quick for us folks, as well as norepinephrine, or noradrenaline is also what it can be called. And if we look at these structures of the neurotransmitters, we can see how the structure looks fairly similar to the amphetamines that they're right next to. And this is true that the structures look the same for kind of the two-dimensional drawings that I have here on the slide, but also for the three-dimensional drawings, right? The overall shapes that you're seeing here of the neurotransmitters compared to the amphetamines is very similar. And so here I kind of want us to remember what we learned about how proteins function, in particular, how something like a receptor would work. If you recall, receptors are looking to bind or grab on to something that we call its ligand, right? And so a receptor in the brain is looking for a shape specific to it of its neurotransmitter. And so if amphetamines are basically the same shape, the amphetamine is going to be able to bind onto that protein, bind onto that receptor, similarly to what it's normally used to binding to, the neurotransmitter. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that in folks with ADHD, they had low levels of dopamine and low levels of norepinephrine. Well, using an amphetamine on folks with ADHD, in particular, for example, using Adderall, we'll see that the brain chemistry is corrected. So, for example, we will have now increased dopamine and increased norepinephrine as a result of the use of Adderall. So up next, let's dive into the details of how Adderall corrects the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain.